Hello and welcome to our Bible study of Genesis chapter 20. Genesis chapter 20 is the second time that Abraham will nearly lose his wife to a foreign leader. Some think they are variations of the same event because surely no one would make the same mistake twice. Apparently the critic does not know human nature very well. In fact, the text makes clear in verse 13 that this was Abraham's standard practice when he was in a foreign land. We are still within the 12-month time frame between the most recent promise of Sarah's pregnancy from chapter 18 verse 10 and its fulfillment in the very next chapter. But Abraham is still concerned about potentially being killed for the sake of Sarah. Apparently the matriarch was still attractive to other men. This event is the first time the word sin is used by humans in reference to fellow humans. It is also the first occurrence of the word to pray, as Abraham made intercession on behalf of Abimelech, as he had done earlier for the Sodomites, where the action was found but not the word to pray. It is also the first occurrence of the word prophet, although Enoch is referred to as a prophet by Jude in verse 14. So let's read the text. Now Abraham traveled from there to the land of the Negev, and stayed between Kadesh and Shur, and he stayed temporarily in Gerar. Excuse me. Negev refers to the south of Palestine. Kadesh and Shur are on the way to Egypt. And yet scholars do not know exactly where Gerar is located. The verb stayed temporarily is related to the verb stranger or alien. Verse 2, Then Abraham said of Sarah his wife, My sister she is. Remember, I'm reading my own translation. And then Abimelech the king of Gerar sent and took Sarah, probably adding her to his harem. God came to Abimelech in a vision at night and said to him, Behold, you are dead, because of the woman whom you took. She is married to a husband. The word husband here is used 161 times, and it is the famous word Baal. It was first used in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 13, where we have translated it the owner of a covenant. The word means an owner, a possessor, a lord, or a husband. The verb is used 16 times, and it means to rule over, to be a lord, or to be a husband. Among the Canaanites, Baal is the name of the storm or fertility god, and it is used 128 times in that sense. First time it is used in Scripture is in Numbers chapter 22 and verse 41. Although the names of certain places like Baal Hanan carries the name of this local deity. Verse 4, But Abimelech did not approach her, and said, My lord, a nation also righteous will you kill? Remember, that's basically Abraham's response to God in chapter 18 relative to Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 5, Did he not say to me, My sister she is? And even she herself said, My brother he is? In the completeness of my heart, even in the innocence of my hands, I did this thing. The word completeness here is related to the very similar word used of Noah in chapter 6 verse 8, or 9 rather, and Abraham in chapter 17 and verse 1. Again, it is the word used to describe a perfect specimen of an animal to be used in sacrifice. The entire word family is used 200 times. Abimelech also said that he was innocent in his hands. The word innocent is only used a few times, but it means cleanness, whiteness, or innocence. What I find fascinating is that God agrees with Abimelech. In verse 6, God said to him in a vision, Even I myself know that in the completeness of your heart you did this thing, and I withheld myself, even I myself, I have withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not give you to touch her. I find it interesting that God acknowledges that Abimelech, even though he was not a member of the chosen family, is recognized as having a heart of integrity and innocent hands. Verse 7, God commands Abimelech, Now bring back the wife of the man, because a prophet he is, and he must pray for you, and you will live. But if there is not for you a bringing back, know that to die you will die, you yourself, and all which is yours. Again, this is the first time the word prophet is used in the Bible. It will be used 377 17 times, and the classic definition of a prophet is Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, which means to speak on behalf of someone else. This is the first time the verb to pray is found in the Bible. There are a dozen different Hebrew words that are synonyms for the action to pray. This is the verb that is used most often, but it is only used twice in the book of Genesis. In this chapter, verse 7 and verse 17. And then God tells Abimelech, to die you will die. That is the same expression that God used of Cain and Abel in the Garden of Eden. You will surely die. Verse 8. So Abimelech arose early in the morning, and called to all his servants, and spoke all these words in their ears, and the men feared greatly. Then Abimelech called to Abraham, and said to him, What did you do to us? And what did I sin against you, that you brought over me and over my kingdom a great sin? Works which they do not do, you did to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you see that you did this thing? And then Abraham said, Because I said only, there is not fear of God in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. And in truth, my sister, the daughter of my father, she is, only not the daughter of my mother, and she became to me for a wife. And it will be just as he caused me to wander, God, from the house of my father. And I said to her, This is the loving loyalty which you do to me. To every place where we come there, say of me, my brother he is. This word loving loyalty is that Hebrew word chesed, which is often translated as loving kindness or steadfast love or mercy. It is covenant loyalty. Here, Abraham expects that covenant loyalty from his wife, Sarah. So they were in the Negev. Understand that the Negev refers to the southern part of Palestine. By the New Testament times, it came to be called Idumea. The area was not good for farming, as they only received about 8 inches of rain per year. I've already mentioned Kadesh is in northeastern Sinai, and Shur are on their way to Egypt. But we do not know where Gerar is exactly. Abimelech, in fact, might be a title, like Pharaoh, or a throne name. So Abraham left Mamre and he traveled south again towards Egypt. Why did Abraham decide to pack up and move? Did the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah frighten him? Did he simply like to change locations frequently? Was he needing better or more pasture for his flocks? Was there conflict at home which he was trying to avoid? We don't know. But this incident, like chapter 12, almost causes problems for Abraham. It would have, if God had not intervened. As Abraham had done in chapter 12, here he informs the leader Abimelech that Sarah was his sister. And then Abimelech took Sarah, denoting the idea of taking her for a wife. God appeared to Abimelech with a simple statement. You are a dead man. That's simple and to the point. The reason God gives is because this woman, Sarah, has a husband. The idea is that she belongs to someone, not as a piece of property, but in a legal sense, an emotional and a spiritual, relational sense. And then God appears to Abimelech. Outside the family of Abraham, Laban will receive a revelation from God in chapter 31. The Egyptian butler and baker in chapter 40 will receive a revelation from God. Pharaoh himself in chapter 41, and then Balaam in Numbers chapter 22, as will Pharaoh Necho and King Nebuchadnezzar. And so God did not always reveal himself only to Israelites or to Hebrews. Abimelech, respectfully calling God Lord, defends himself in several ways. First, Moses tells us that Abimelech had in fact not gone into Sarah to sleep with her. Whether it was because he had been plagued in some way by God or not, we are not sure. Secondly, Abimelech, echoing Abraham's thoughts of God in chapter 18 and verse 25, asks God if he would slay a righteous nation. The belief is that God is too righteous to kill a nation full of good people, in contrast with the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. Thirdly, Abimelech reminds God that both Abraham and Sarah had informed him that they were siblings. Fourth, Abimelech tells God that his motives are pure. He has completeness of heart, and his actions are pure. He has innocence of hands. It is interesting that God acknowledged that Abimelech acted in innocence. At the same time, God tells Abimelech that he must have Abraham, a prophet, pray on behalf of Abimelech, otherwise he would be killed. and God is emphatic. Observe when he threatens Abimelech with death. This shows us that even in the absence of a written law code, God expected Abimelech and mankind to respect certain moral values. Observe that adultery is viewed as a sin against God. We do not know how God kept Abimelech from Sarah, but it was through some providential means, no doubt. Not only would Abimelech pay with his life if he disobeys God, but so would his family and apparently his own people. God gives Abimelech the freedom to obey or not to obey, but he does not give him the freedom to choose the consequences of that choice. In the ancient Near East, the role of prophet was generally held by priests of their respective gods. However, there was not as much overlap in the Israelite religion, although there were notable priest prophets in biblical history, such as Samuel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Abimelech wastes no time in responding to God's threat. He rises early in the morning and he tells his people what God had said, and they all feared greatly, showing that Abraham had completely misjudged the people in verse 11. And then Abimelech, out of fear and perhaps anger, fires a round of questions at Abraham. What have you done? What sin did I commit against you that you brought this great sin against my kingdom? Observe here that Abimelech believed, as was generally acknowledged in the ancient Near East, that adultery was a great sin. The phrase great sin is used 4 other times, all of which refer to idolatry. This might be part of the link between idolatry and spiritual adultery. The questions from Abimelech continued. Why have you done things against me that ought not to be done? Abimelech is accusing Abraham of ignoring the most basic rules of hospitality. Verse 10 records a separate statement by Abimelech, as if he had to pause and take a deep breath. He wanted to know what Abraham was thinking. What was he expecting to find in Gerar that motivated him to lie? Both Abimelech's and his men's fear, without the existence of a written law, shows that the final restraint on men's moral choices is the consciousness that they are accountable to the God of heaven. Abraham, forgetting God's challenge in chapter 15 and verse 1, did fear, and then that fear led him to jeopardize the promise. If Abimelech had had sexual relations with Sarah, it could not have been known that the baby was Abraham's by promise. Out of fear, Abraham had jumped to a false conclusion about Abimelech and his people. That was Abraham's first response and his visceral reaction, although it was certainly a wrong assumption. Secondly, Abraham responded that he was only half lying since they were half siblings. They had the same father but not the same mother. That doesn't seem to make Abimelech any happier, as we will see in verse 16. Finally, Abraham tried to justify his position by stating that deception about their relationship had been their standard operating procedure whenever they had gone, as if that were to make Abimelech feel better. Abraham tells Sarah it would be her loving loyalty to Abraham if she were to keep the full truth a secret. Again, it is easy to criticize Abraham sharply looking at his life through the lens of the New Testament or even through the law of Moses. But let's not forget that Abraham had lived among pagan gods for 75 years before God called him to separate himself. You could take man out of the deceptive environment, but apparently you could not take the deception entirely out of the man. Be that as it may, God stepped in, tolerated Abraham's weak faith, and kept Abimelech from taking Sarah as a wife, or even having sexual relations with her, so that there could be no doubt that her child was Abraham's child. Adultery will be punished by death in the law of Moses. Marrying one's half-sister will also be condemned by the law. We've already noted that chapter 20 is one of the few chapters in Genesis with no quotation or no direct allusion in the New Testament. However, Jesus still forbids adultery under his covenant. Adultery is mentioned 23 times in the New Testament. Jesus also defines adultery as marrying a man or woman who had not divorced their first spouse on the basis of sexual immorality. It is still a great sin in the eyes of God. Verses 14 through 18. Then Abimelech took a flock and cattle and servants and female servants and gave to Abraham and brought back to him Sarah, his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before you, in the good land in your eyes dwell. Then to Sarah he said, Behold, I give 1,000 pieces of silver even to your brother. Behold, he is to you a covering for the eyes, for all of which is yours, and all in you are vindicated. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his female slaves, and they gave birth. Because to close, Jehovah closed every womb at the house of Abimelech, on account of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Abimelech's generosity is impressive, especially considering how Abraham had treated him. He gives Abraham a flock of sheep, cattle, male and female servants, as well as Sarah, untouched sexually. In some way, fulfilling God's promise of land to Abraham, Abimelech offers Abraham any place in his land where he could dwell if he so desired. Then to Sarah, Abimelech spoke of a substantial gift given to her brother. The 1,000 pieces of silver would have been a sizable sum, weighing around 25 pounds of silver. As far as we can tell, that would have been more than the typical worker would have earned in a lifetime. By way of comparison, Abraham will purchase their burial site for 400 shekels of silver. The land of Shechem will sell for 100 shekels, and a slave could be purchased for 20 shekels. The phrase a covering for the eyes, as I have translated it in verse 16, is a figurative expression, not literally referring to a veil, but a figurative reference to a veil. It suggests overlooking a wrong, to preclude criticisms. It could suggest the undefiled honor of a woman. Finally, Abraham will intercede on behalf of Abimelech just as he did with Sodom in chapter 18, verses 23 through 33. And then God will heal Abimelech. We do not know what Abimelech had suffered, but it seems to have had to do with childbearing. God had completely closed their wombs. The force of the verb to close, he closed, because Abimelech had taken Sarah. As long as Abraham has no wife, Abimelech will have no children. It is ironic that Abraham's prayer opened the wombs of Abimelech's household, but it had not for Sarah for over 24 years. Of course, we know why. God wants Abraham, Sarah, and all subsequent generations to know that the gift of Isaac would be by God's miraculous power, not by any human effort or merit. And yet we learn from this that sometimes when it seems God is not listening to our prayers, it's because God has something better planned. We just have to be patient and trust God. Just as in chapter 12, God turned a potentially disastrous situation into a form of a blessing, just as he had promised back in chapter 12. Abraham left the Pharaoh of Egypt a wealthier man in chapter 12, and he will leave Abimelech a wealthier man here in chapter 20. God will work all things together for the good of those who love him, despite their imperfections. Romans 8 and verse 28. Israel, as they read the book of Genesis, needed to be reminded regularly that God would provide for their needs. They did not need to take their salvation into their own hands by worshiping idols. God would bless faithful obedience. Again, Abraham here in chapter 20 is an example of the fact that human failure does not cause God's promises to fail. 2 Timothy 2 verse 13. Despite the fact that Christians live in a strange world as aliens and travelers, we must live differently. When we do live differently, the Word will glorify God for this behavior. 1 Peter 2 verses 11 and 12. May the grace of the Lord Jesus be with you, and my love be with you all.